Passengers were still boarding when it happened. The moment that would turn an ordinary flight into the most unforgettable scene anyone on that plane had ever witnessed. She stood quietly in the first-class aisle, a simple woman in plain jeans, a soft sweater, and no makeup. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed wealth. Just calm eyes and a small travel bag in her hands. The flight attendant, however, barely looked at her ticket before forcing a tight smile. "Ma'am, first class is for premium passengers only. Economy is down that way." The woman blinked, confused. "This is my seat," she said softly, holding out her boarding pass. The attendant didn't even read it. "Ma'am, please don't cause delays. First class is already full." Passengers nearby stared, some curious, some annoyed, a few amused. A businessman across the aisle smirked. "Let her through?" She looked out of place up here. A couple in designer clothes whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. People try anything these days. But the woman didn't react. She just tried, once more, to offer her ticket. "Please, I think there's a mistake." The attendant sighed dramatically, snatched the pass from her hand, and suddenly froze. It was a first-class seat. Confirmed. Paid. Verified. But instead of apologizing, the attendant forced a stiff grin. There must be an error in the system. This ticket shouldn't have been issued. The woman's chest tightened. "But Ma'am," the attendant cut in sharply. "You're blocking the aisle. Go wait by the galley while I fix this." She was led away like a problem to be managed. Passengers watched with silent judgment as she stood alone near the curtain, clutching her small bag, trying not to look embarrassed. 10 minutes passed. 12. Finally, the attendant marched over with a triumphant expression. "As I suspected, it was a system glitch. Your seat has been reassigned to economy." The woman's throat tightened. "But I paid for first class. It's a long flight." The attendant shrugged. "Policies are policies. You can take it up with the airline when we land." The woman hesitated, hurt, confused, but she nodded and quietly walked toward economy. Every stare felt like a slap. Some passengers hid their smirks behind magazines. Others looked away, pretending not to see. She didn't argue. She didn't demand anything. She simply took the cramped middle seat she'd been given and folded her hands in her lap. But as boarding continued, a calm ripple moved through the cabin, because someone had just stepped onto the plane. Tall, sharp suit, confident stride, a face that turned heads without trying. The murmurs started instantly. "Is that? No way, is he really here? That's the CEO, the billionaire owner. Why is he on this flight?" The flight attendant instantly straightened, her entire demeanor flipping into polished professionalism. "Sir, welcome aboard. What an honor." But the man didn't look at her. His eyes swept first class, then business, then landed on the quiet woman sitting in economy. And everything about him changed. His face softened, his chest lifted, his pace quickened. He walked straight to her. Passengers stared, shocked, as he leaned down and cupped her cheek gently. "There you are," he murmured. "I've been looking for you." The entire cabin froze. The attendant's face drained of color. The simple woman looked up, startled. "You're here early," she whispered. He smiled warmly. "I wanted to surprise you." And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned to the stunned flight attendant. "Why," he asked quietly, "is my wife sitting in economy?" A silence, so deep it felt physical, fell over the cabin. The woman blinked rapidly. The businessman who'd mocked her swallowed hard. Every whisper died instantly. The attendant opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The billionaire stepped closer, eyes icy now. "I want to hear the full explanation," he said, "and I want everyone here to hear it too." The attendant's hands began to shake, and the woman in the middle seat stared up at her husband, realizing something. This was only the beginning of what was about to happen. The flight attendant's lips trembled as every pair of eyes in first class, business, and even economy locked onto her. "Sir, I think there was a misunderstanding," she stammered, forcing a fake smile that looked more like a grimace. "Your wife's boarding pass. It must have been misprinted. I simply tried to—" "Misprinted?" he echoed, raising a brow. "Interesting. Because she booked that seat using my employee access code, which means the system can't misprint it. Her face drained even further. A murmur swept through the plane. The quiet woman shifted nervously, wanting to ease the tension. "It's okay," she whispered to her husband. "Really, I didn't want to make trouble." He shook his head gently. "You didn't. Someone else did." Then, turning back to the attendant, he said in a voice calm enough to be terrifying, "Where is the supervisor for this flight?" I can get him," she squeaked. "You should," he replied. "Now." She practically sprinted down the aisle, disappearing behind the curtain. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, whispering furiously. "That's his wife. She's married to him? She looked so normal. I can't believe they treated her like that." The businessman who had mocked her earlier sank deeper into his seat, trying to make himself invisible. The fancy couple who whispered about her rushed to look at their phones, pretending they hadn't said anything. The billionaire lowered his voice and looked at his wife. "What happened?" he asked gently. She sighed. "I showed her my ticket, and she said I didn't belong in first class. She didn't even look at it." He clenched his jaw. She didn't look because she made an assumption. He brushed her hair behind her ear, his expression softening. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that." "It's fine," she said softly. "I didn't want a scene." "You didn't create one," he answered, "but they're about to fix theirs." Just then, the supervisor hurried over, a man in his 50s with a polished uniform and a nervous smile. "Mr. Hale." "Sir." "I wasn't informed you'd be traveling today." It was a last-minute decision, the billionaire said simply, and apparently a revealing one. The supervisor swallowed. "What seems to be the problem?" Before the billionaire could speak, the simple woman lifted her hand slightly. "I was told I couldn't sit in the seat I booked," she said softly, "and that I needed to move to economy. I didn't want trouble." The supervisor shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, you should never have been treated that way." The billionaire's voice dropped lower. "Tell me, is this how your airline treats paying passengers? Or only the ones who don't look wealthy?" The supervisor's face turned red. "Absolutely not. I assure you, this will be corrected immediately." He turned to the quiet girl. "Ma'am, please, let me personally escort you back to your seat in first class." But her husband stepped in. "No," he said, "she's not going back alone." And with that, he took her hand and helped her stand. Everyone watched frozen as the couple walked toward first class, the supervisor leading the way. Just before they reached the curtain, the billionaire stopped, turned, and looked directly at the flight attendant who had mistreated his wife. "We'll talk after takeoff," he said quietly. "Don't go far." The attendant's knees buckled. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks. The simple woman felt her heart pounding. Not because she wanted anyone punished, but because she couldn't believe how fast everything had changed. Only minutes ago, she'd been humiliated. Now, the entire plane stood in stunned silence. As she sank gently into her first-class seat, her husband sat beside her, took her hand, and whispered, "You deserve respect. Always. No matter what you're wearing or where you're sitting." She smiled softly, touched. But the drama wasn't over. Because just as they were settling in, a new problem surfaced, one far bigger than rude staff or seating mistakes. And it was coming straight down the aisle toward them. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit stormed down the aisle with the kind of authority that made everyone instinctively sit up straighter. His expression was tight, controlled, but his eyes burned with the heat of someone who'd heard enough whispers to know something serious had happened. The supervisor spotted him and whispered under his breath, "Oh, no." The billionaire's wife looked confused. "Who is that?" Her husband exhaled slowly. "Head of International Operations. He almost never gets involved personally." Passengers shrank back as the man approached, turning the already tense atmosphere electric. Even the murmurs died out. He stopped right in front of the couple. "Mr. Hale," he said, voice steady but clearly strained. "I was notified of an incident." The billionaire tilted his head slightly. That's one word for it. The man's gaze flicked to the simple woman, and for the first time, the sternness on his face melted into something apologetic. "Ma'am, I am deeply sorry. I was under the impression you were in your assigned seat. She wasn't allowed to sit in it, her husband replied. The head of operations took a slow breath. I would like to hear the details from her directly. She looked up timidly. I showed my ticket. She didn't believe me. She said first class wasn't for people like me. She lowered her eyes, unsure how much to say. But her husband gently squeezed her hand, encouraging her to continue. She took my ticket, walked away, and came back saying it was a mistake. She was very rude about it. The man nodded, his face darkening with every word. I see, he said softly, too softly. Passengers nearby exchanged nervous glances. That tone meant someone was in a lot of trouble. Mr. Hale, the operations chief, said, the flight attendant will be relieved of duty immediately upon landing. And I promise this won't be brushed aside. The billionaire's voice remained calm, but his eyes were razor sharp. I'm not looking for anyone to lose their livelihood, he said. My wife would never want that. She nodded quickly. Yes, I just didn't want to be treated like that. The man bowed his head slightly. Understood. And we'll make sure this never happens again. Not to you, not to anyone. But just when it seemed the situation had settled, a new voice rang out from behind. That's ridiculous. She doesn't deserve first class. Everyone turned. It was the businessman who had mocked her earlier, the man in the expensive suit who had smirked and whispered that she didn't look like she belonged. He was standing now, red-faced and trembling with indignation. This is insane, he barked. People like her, dressed like that, shouldn't get special treatment just because her husband is rich. Silence slammed through the cabin. The billionaire didn't look angry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up slowly, so slowly that the businessman leaned back instinctively. What did you say? The billionaire asked, his tone calm but laced with danger. The businessman's mouth worked, but no sound came out. Let me explain something. The billionaire continued. My wife doesn't need money to deserve respect. She doesn't have to dress fancy. She doesn't have to prove herself to anyone. He stepped closer. You, on the other hand, just proved exactly why people like you should think before speaking. Passengers held their breath. The businessman swallowed hard, shrinking back into his seat. But the billionaire wasn't done. You judged her because of her clothes, he said. But tell me, who paid for your ticket? The businessman stuttered. I did. Really? The billionaire said, a faint smirk forming. Funny, because I recognize you. You're an employee. You used a staff family discount. Gasps echoed through the cabin. The businessman paled. And unlike you, the billionaire added, my wife doesn't need a discount. The businessman collapsed back into his seat, hiding his face. The quiet woman looked up at her husband in awe, but also with worry. Please, she whispered, let's just finish the flight peacefully. He nodded softly and sat down, placing his hand over hers. But while he respected her wish for calm, the universe had other plans. Because just then, over the speakers, the captain's voice crackled through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unexpected situation. The wife's eyes widened. Her husband straightened. And every passenger froze. The real trouble was only beginning. The cabin went still. Every heartbeat seemed to echo as the captain's voice continued. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a last-minute system alert, we need to verify a potential mechanical issue before takeoff. Please remain seated. A ripple of unease moved through the passengers, but the billionaire's wife felt her husband squeeze her hand gently. It's routine, he whispered. Nothing to worry about. But she could see the tension in his jaw. He knew airplanes better than anyone. He owned the company, after all. And something in his eyes told her this wasn't just a routine alert. Moments later, the captain himself stepped out of the cockpit. He walked straight toward the billionaire, nodding respectfully. Sir, may I speak with you for a moment? The billionaire stood, his expression serious. Of course. The two men whispered quietly near the curtain, while passengers strained to hear. The wife watched, her heart pounding. After a minute, the captain stepped away, but her husband remained still for a moment, thinking deeply. Finally, he returned to her seat. What is it? She asked softly. He exhaled slowly. The alert was real, a minor sensor malfunction, not dangerous. Yet, but if they hadn't checked, it could have caused issues during landing. She covered her mouth, shaken. "Oh my, that could have been." He nodded. "Exactly." And the captain insisted on addressing it immediately. "That's why he's the best." A small smile appeared on his face. "I hired him myself." She let out a relieved breath as the captain returned to the cockpit. Moments later, he spoke again over the speakers. "Thank you for your patience. The issue has been resolved. We are cleared for takeoff." Applause broke out across the plane, tension melting into relief. But something deeper had shifted. As the engines began to roar and the plane rolled toward the runway, the passengers began approaching one by one, quietly, respectfully, to speak to the billionaire's wife. A woman from business class leaned over. "I judged you too quickly. I'm sorry." A young man whispered, "You handled everything with so much grace." Even the businessman, the one who had insulted her, approached with trembling hands. I was wrong," he muttered. "Completely wrong. I'm sorry." She didn't gloat. She didn't lecture. She simply smiled kindly and said, "Thank you." When the plane lifted into the sky, her husband leaned close, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. "See," he whispered, "people are learning. Because of you." She laughed softly. "Because of this whole dramatic situation." He grinned. "True, but mostly because of you." Hours later, when the plane landed safely, the staff lined up outside the jet bridge, supervisor included, to apologize formally. The attendant who had mistreated her was suspended, not fired, and the quiet woman insisted on speaking with her privately. "I don't want you to lose your job," she said gently. "Just treat people kindly. That's all." Tears filled the attendant's eyes. "I will. I promise." Before leaving the airport, the billionaire wrapped an arm around his wife and whispered, "You may look simple to some, but to me and now to everyone else, you're extraordinary." She blushed, leaning against him, and as they walked away, hand in hand, the passengers who had once judged her now watched with respect, and maybe even a little awe. The simple woman who had been denied a first-class seat left the airport as the one person no one would ever underestimate again.